Greetings. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another beautiful day. Wow, what an awesome day it has been for the end of April. Just absolutely gorgeous today. Today is episode 32 of Karl's Spirit Month, 3 months, whatever we want to call this. And tonight we're going to be tasting the James E. Pepper 1776 straight bourbon whiskey. That's James E. Pepper, 1776, straight bourbon whiskey. Guys, I got to tell you, I've got a soft spot for this one. So, full disclosure there. This one's got a heck of a good history and story to it. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of that right now. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the drink itself because it's also fairly good. James E. Pepper was started by, you guessed it, James E. Pepper. He's a third generation distiller of Kentucky bourbon royalty. James Pepper purchased a mothballed distillery by the name of the Henry Clay Distillery in the mid 1800s and began to produce bourbon. Incidentally, his grandfather and father, who was Oscar Pepper, built the distillery where Woodford Reserve stands today. So this guy's got bourbon in his blood, so to speak. He's going to continue to produce bourbon according to his grandfather's recipes that dated all the way from the American Revolution, hence the 1776 brand. Pepper was known as a very good distiller, but a better businessman. Very astutely, he socialized with the right people to get his bourbon among the highest reaches of American society in the late 1800s. He socialized with leading industrialists such as Morton of Morton Salt fame, Rockefeller, Pabst, Pillsbury, Steinway, Tiffany, Vanderbilt. You're getting the picture here. He also was a confidant of all people, Theodore Roosevelt. So well done, James E. Pepper. It was during all this socialization at the Waldorf Astoria Bar, hotel bar in New York City, that he actually introduced these gentlemen and others to a new bourbon drink, the Old Fashioned. Now, he didn't invent the Old Fashioned, but he certainly got its popularity rolling among high society. It was actually invented by a bartender in Indianapolis. So Pepper knew this guy, took the recipe with him to New York, and really spread the love of the Old Fashioned, which required, of course, great bourbon. The Pepper Distillery continued even after his death. Ultimately, though, it will close in 1917. Prohibition just around the corner would have been a death knell for the distillery anyway. During Prohibition, it did not produce alcohol. However, it was used to warehouse bourbon for medicinal use. So other producers would produce their spirits for medicinal use, and they would, such as let's say the Stag, George T. Stagg, or perhaps Brown Foreman, they would use the warehouses at Pepper to hold their liquor for medicinal use. Ultimately, the site is going to be purchased by Shinley in 1934, and distillation will begin again using the James E. Pepper brand. And it's going to produce alcohol all the way up till 1958. During World War II in Korea, they really slowed down production and made alcohol for the Army. That's distilled alcohol for like medicinal use. Not drinking alcohol, but rubbing alcohol. Back in 2008, the brand is going to be relaunched, and this is the brand that we know, and it's in this bottle here today, by an entrepreneur by the name of Amir Pia. That's P-E-A. He is going to use sourced whiskey, and then he's going to follow up with that, and in about 2012 or 13, he's going to purchase the old James E. Pepper Distillery property. And after several years and multi-million-dollar rehab of the property itself, in 2017, they began to produce bourbon there once more under the James E. Pepper brand. As I mentioned earlier, this is a sourced bourbon. It is from MGP, Midwest Grain Products. This is a powerhouse of whiskey distilling. It's located in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, and ultimately this will be bottled in Kentucky. By the way, MGP produces a lot of bourbon, a lot of whiskeys that is then sold to other companies and then bottled under their name. It's assumed that since this is a relatively young bourbon, and it is young, it's only about 3 years old, perhaps four, that they're going to be using their own product somewhat soon. As I said, they began producing in 17. If this is a 3-year-old product, so in 2020, late 2020, we might be getting some actual James E. Pepper juice and not MGP juice in the bottle. So let's talk about the bourbon. That's enough of the history. Mash bill is actually somewhat shocking. 57% corn. And you're saying, well, that's not very high. No, it is not. 51% is the legal amount for bourbon. And this is 57. It has 39% rye. That is an incredibly high rye mash bill. That leaves 4% for malted barley. It's aged for 3 to 4 years, and it's bottled at 100 proof. Now, if you just told me this is 39% rye and only 3 or 4 years old at 100 proof, I'm going to tell you this glass is going to smell very, very alcoholic. In fact, it's just the opposite. I don't know if you can see well, but this is a nice light to medium copper color in the glass. It's got good legs. They're a little on the runnier side that I would like to see, but the legs really stick well. So it looks great in the glass. On the nose, big caramel. It's a big, big whiff of caramel right off the bat. You're also getting some great vanilla notes that I think are really big here. And because it's a young bourbon, I'm also getting corn, young raw corn. And then there are some baking spices and cinnamons thrown in there as well that kind of lead you to believe this is not as old as you might think at first glance. But it does not have that rye or alcohol burn that I would assume a nose on a 3-year-old high rye would have. So what does it taste like? Well, great question. It tastes good. It's got a medium mouthfeel that's very light on the tongue. It doesn't just sit there. You can chew it just a little bit, but it's not water either. So it's right in the middle, and it's very light despite that high rye. I think it really leads with that baking spice, but it's followed quickly by a lot of sweetness. Burnt brown sugar, caramelized brown sugar, honey roasted nuts in here. Kind of like you pop open that honey roasted peanut or honey roasted mixed nuts planters jar. Take a good whiff. That's kind of what you're getting here. A lot of those honey roasted flavors. There's also a little charred oak in here, which really shocks me for such a young whiskey. And then there's some dark chocolate here at the very end that I think is just really kind of cool. The finish is medium long and actually kind of buttery for such a young bourbon. And parking right in the middle of the tongue where it sets and lingers is that sweet cinnamon. And it just sits there and just percolates. You get a little bit of a throat burn, not bad at all for such a high rye, and very little chest burn, but it's just got a nice lingering medium long finish. So my takeaway, I'm actually kind of impressed with this drink. I would never have dreamed that a bottle of bourbon with this much rye, that's the 1776, would taste as sweet as this particular bourbon does. For a 3-year-old bourbon, maybe 4, I think it's surprisingly aged well. It has a much deeper flavor profile than I would ever imagine. Certainly much deeper than some of those 6 year olds that we saw earlier this week, or they claim that are 6 years old, that have almost no flavor whatsoever. This is much better aged. So, as I've set out here by the fire pit, been thinking about the Karl rating on this one. And on my notes, I've got this as a 3.75. But I'm going to tell you it's only a 3.75 because it's almost like a 3.99 star. I'll be honest. It's almost a 4 star. My only regret with this is I wish it was a little bit more heavy in the mouth. I wish it had a little bit more syrupy texture. I think this would make it an outstanding bourbon. But as it is, I think it's a very good bourbon. So you could call it a 3.75, you could call it a 3.99, whichever. It's a really good bourbon, and the price makes it even better. We're talking mid 30s for a bottle of James E. Pepper 1776. Yes, it's old timey. Yes, it's historical. I get that. But the taste, again, what's in the bottle is what really matters. So that's why I'm giving it that Karl rating today. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, stay safe, peace, and happy pours.